Let's take a look at perception. Perception is a process by which we interpret sensory impressions to give meaning to our environment. What we perceive can be substantially different from objective reality. Why is perception important in the study of organizational behavior? It is important because people's behavior is based on their perception of what reality is, not on reality itself. In other words, our perception becomes the reality from which we act. To understand what all of us have in common in our interpretations of reality, we need to begin with the factors that influence our perceptions. These factors can reside in the perceiver, the object or target being perceived, or the situation. The perception concepts most relevant to OB include person perceptions. Many of our perceptions of others are formed by first impressions and small cues that have little supporting evidence. This is particularly troublesome, but common when we infer another person's morality. Attribution theory tries to explain the ways we judge people differently depending on the meaning we attribute to a behavior. For instance, we assign meaning to smiles and other expressions in many ways. Attribution theory suggests that when we observe an individual's behavior, we attempt to determine whether it's internally or externally caused. That depends largely on three factors: distinctiveness, consensus, and consistency. Internally caused behaviors are those that an observer believes to be under the personal behavioral control of another individual. Externally caused behavior is what we imagine the situation forced the individual to do. If an employee is late for work, you might attribute that to overnight partying and oversleeping. This is an internal attribution. But if you attribute his lateness to a traffic snarl, you're making an external attribution. Distinctiveness refers to whether an individual displays different behaviors in different situations. Is the employee who arrives late today also one who regularly blows off other kinds of commitments? When we make judgments about the behavior of other people, we tend to underestimate the influence of external factors and overestimate the influence of internal or personal factors. People tend to attribute ambiguous information as relatively flattering, accept positive feedback, and reject negative feedback. This is called self-serving bias. The concept of attribution theory helps us to identify why we draw certain conclusions from behavior. Individuals make decisions from alternatives largely influenced by their perceptions. Individual decision-making is an important factor of behavior at all levels of an organization. Decision-making occurs as a reaction to a problem. That is, a discrepancy exists between the current state of affairs and some desired state, requiring us to consider alternative courses of action. Unfortunately, most problems don't come neatly labeled. One person's problem is another person's satisfactory state of affairs. Every decision requires us to interpret and evaluate information. We typically receive data from multiple sources that we need to screen, process, and interpret. Our perceptual process will affect the outcome. We should consider how our perceptions for the situation influence our decisions. People are so uncomfortable saying no that they may agree to unethical acts. Generally accepted constructs of decision-making are employed by each of us to make determinations. These constructs are rational decision-making, bounded rationality, and intuition. Though their processes make sense, they may not lead to the most accurate or best decisions in a given situation. We often think the best decision-maker is rational and makes consistent, value-maximizing choices within specified constraints. Rational decisions follow a six-step rational decision-making model. Because the human mind cannot formulate and solve complex problems with full rationality, we operate within the confines of bounded rationality. We construct simplified models to extract the essential features from problems without capturing all of their complexity. We can then behave rationally within the limits of the simple model. To use the rational model, you need to gather a great deal of information about all the options, compute acceptable weights, and calculate values across a huge number of criteria. Perhaps the least rational way of making decisions is intuitive decision-making, an unconscious process which relies on links between disparate pieces of information, meaning it engages the emotions. While intuition isn't rational, it isn't necessarily wrong, nor does it always contradict rational analysis. The two can complement each other. Decision makers engage in bounded rationality, but they also allow systematic biases and errors to creep into their judgments. Relying too heavily on feelings and shortcuts can distort rationality. We even tend to seek resources most likely to tell us what we want to hear, and we give too much weight to supporting information and too little to contradictory. Most of us like to think that we have some control over our world. Our tendency to believe we can predict the outcome of random events is randomness error. Our individual differences play a significant role in our decision making processes. We turn here to factors that influence the way people make decisions and the degree to which they're susceptible to errors and bias. We discuss individual differences and then organizational constraints. Decision making in practice is characterized by bounded rationality, common biases and errors, and the use of intuition. Individual differences, such as personality, also influence our decisions. People with high self esteem, a general perception of being good enough, are strongly motivated to maintain it, so they use the self serving bias to preserve it. They blame others for their failures while taking credit for successes. We know people with higher levels of mental ability can process information more quickly, solve problems more accurately, and learn faster, so you might expect them to be less susceptible to common decision errors. Cultures differ in time orientation, the value they place on rationality, their belief in the ability of people to solve problems, and their preference for collective decision making. While rationality is valued in North America, that's not true elsewhere. Some cultures emphasize solving problems, while others focus on accepting situations as they are. Organizations and precedents can constrain decision makers, creating deviations from the rational model. Managers are also influenced by the criteria on which they're evaluated. The organization's reward systems influence decision makers by suggesting which choices have better personal payoffs. If the organization's rewards risk aversion, managers are more likely to make conservative decisions. Decisions aren't made in a vacuum, they have context. Individual decisions are points in a stream of choices. Those made in the past constrain current choices. Choices made today are largely a result of choices made over the years. The first is utilitarianism, which proposes making decisions to provide the greatest good for all. This view dominates business decision making and is consistent with goals such as efficiency, productivity, and high profits. Keep in mind that utilitarianism is not always an objective as it sounds. Another ethical criterion is to make decisions consistent with fundamental liberties, an emphasis on protecting the basic rights of individuals, such as the right to privacy, free speech, and due process. This criterion protects whistleblowers when they reveal an organization's unethical practices to the press or government agencies, using their right to free speech. A third criterion is to impose and enforce rules fairly and impartially to ensure justice or equitable distribution of benefits and costs. Decisions makers, particularly in for-profit organizations, feel comfortable with utilitarianism. The best interests of the organizations and its stockholders can justify a lot of questionable actions, such as large layoffs. But many critics feel this perspective needs to change. Public concern about individual rights and social justice suggests managers should develop ethical standards based on non-utilitarian criteria. This presents a challenge because satisfying individual rights and social justice creates far more ambiguities than utilitarian effects on efficiency and profit. This is where corporate social responsibility comes into effect and makes a positive change. As we can see by looking at utilitarian ideals, organizations are not motivated to respond equitably when they're looking only at a balance sheet. Researchers are turning increasingly to behavioral ethics, which tells us that, while ethical standards exist collectively in societies and organizations, we do not always follow ethical standards promoted by our organizations. We sometimes violate our own standards, and our own ethical behavior varies widely from one situation to the next. How might we increase ethical decision making in organizations? Managers should encourage conversations about moral issues. They may serve as a reminder and increase ethical decision making. An environment that encourages open discussions and does not penalize people for coming forward is key to overcoming blind spots and increasing the ethicality of decision making. Behavioral ethics research stresses the importance of culture to ethical decision making. Many of us would not like to be labeled as a liar. But if a liar is merely someone who lies, we're all liars. Lying is one of the top unethical activities we may indulge in daily, and it undermines all efforts towards sound decision making. The truth is that one of the reasons we lie is because lying is difficult for others to detect. In more than 200 studies, individuals correctly identified people who were lying only 47% of the time, which is less than random picking. One technique is to study a person's body language, but researchers found that the probability of detecting lying based solely on body language was less than a random guess. Liars may indeed give verbal cues, but which cues apply to which people is a matter of debate. Whether liars tell better stories or conversely give fewer details isn't certain. Managers and organizations simply cannot make good decisions when facts are misrepresented and people give false motives for their behaviors. Lying is a big ethical problem as well. Organizational behavior studies ways to prevent lying by creating environments not conducive to lying. Most of us probably agree that if we lied less, organizations and society would be better off. So, how can we get ourselves to lie less often? Research conducted by behavioral scientists suggests some steps to recovery. We underestimate the degree to which we lie. We overestimate our morality compared to that of others. So, step one is to admit the truth. Lying is learned at a very young age. Negotiation research shows that we're more likely to lie in the future when our lies have succeeded or gone undetected in the past. Managers need to eliminate situations where lying is available. If we want more honesty, we have to provide greater incentives for the truth. Creative behavior occurs in 4 steps, each of which leads to the next. Any act of creativity begins with a problem that the behavior is designed to solve. Thus, problem formulation is the stage of creative behavior in which we identify a problem or opportunity that requires a solution that is yet unknown. Given a problem, a solution is rarely directly at hand. Thus, information gathering is the stage when knowledge is sought and possible solutions to a problem incubate in an individual's mind. Idea generation is the process of creative behavior in which we develop possible solutions to a problem from relevant information and knowledge. Increasingly, idea generation is collaborative. Finally, it's time to choose from the ideas we've generated. Thus, idea evaluation is the process of creative behavior in which we evaluate potential solutions to identify the best one. Sometimes the method of choosing can be innovative itself. Most people have some of the characteristics shared by exceptionally creative people. The more of these characteristics they have, the higher our creative potential. Innovation is one of the top organizational goals for leaders. Consider these factors of potential. Intelligent people are more creative because they're better at solving complex problems. They also may be more creative because they can recall more information related to the task at hand. Many personality traits influence creativity, including proactive personality, self-confidence, risk-taking, tolerance for ambiguity, and perseverance. Hope, self-efficacy, and positive effect also predict an individual's creativity. Expertise is at the foundation for all creative work and the most important predictor of creative potential. The potential for creativity is enhanced when individuals have knowledge, abilities, and similar expertise to their field of endeavor. Although creativity is linked to many desirable individual characteristics, it's not correlated with ethicality. According to recent research, it may be that dishonesty and creativity can both stem from rule breaking desire. Most of us have creative potential we can learn to apply, but by itself is not enough. We need to be in an environment where creative potential can be realized. If you aren't motivated to be creative, it's unlikely you will be. Intrinsic motivation, or the desire to work on something because it's interesting, exciting, and satisfying, correlates moderately with creative outcomes. Good leadership matters to creativity. One study of more than 100 teams working in a large bank revealed that when the leader behaved in a punitive, unsupportive manner, the teams were less creative. When leaders encourage the development of their employees, they're more creative. Creative behavior does not always produce an innovative outcome. An employee might generate a creative idea and never share it. Management might reject a creative solution. One study showed that most people have a bias against accepting creative ideas because ideas create uncertainty. We can define creative outcomes as ideas or solutions judged to be novel and useful by relevant stakeholders. Novelty itself does not generate a creative outcome if it isn't useful. Solutions are creative only if they help solve the problem. The usefulness of a solution might be self-evident or might be considered successful only by stakeholders. An organization may harvest many creative ideas from its employees and call itself innovative. However, as one expert stated, ideas are useless unless used. Soft skills help translate ideas into results.